I can still picture the exact section of the creek where this happened. It was one of those places we practically lived at during the summer. It was a narrow stream that ran behind a neighborhood development and cut through a stretch of trees before connecting to a larger river a few miles away. Kids from the area were always down there. People walked their dogs nearby, teenagers hung out there after school, and families came down on weekends. It wasn't an isolated place where you would expect something strange. It was somewhere that felt safe. I'm Ashley. I was old enough to be out with friends without parents constantly checking on us, but still young enough that entire summer days seemed endless. My friend, let's call her M, lived 4 streets over from me, and we spent a ridiculous amount of time together that year. On the day this happened, we had been walking around for hours already. We wandered through a neighborhood park and eventually ended up at the creek because it was hot. The water wasn't deep enough to really swim in most places. You mostly just waded around, sat on rocks, or floated in the wider sections. We had left our shoes near a fallen tree and were standing knee-deep in the water, talking about school starting again in a few weeks. I don't remember what we were discussing before we noticed the man, because the conversation immediately left my memory after that. What I do remember is M suddenly looking past me and asking, "Do you know him?" I turned around expecting to see someone from the neighborhood. There was a man standing on the bank. He looked so normal that it's hard to describe him now. Average height, average build. It's the way he was looking at us. He wasn't walking past. He was just standing there staring at us. I assumed he was somebody's dad looking for their kid. M waved awkwardly. The man didn't wave back. He didn't smile. He continued staring. After another minute, M quietly said, "Let's go." Neither of us said anything to the man. We grabbed our shoes and started following the trail that led back toward the neighborhood. The weird thing was that when we first left, neither of us was actually scared. We were uncomfortable, but it felt like one of those situations where you encounter a strange person and move on with your day. We rounded a bend in the trail, and the same man was standing ahead of us. Even now, I struggle to explain that part. The creek trail curved through a wooded area. There was technically another route that connected to a bike path, but it would have taken several minutes to reach the point where we saw him again. Yet somehow he was already there, standing beside the trail, watching us. I remember both of us slowing down at the exact same time. M grabbed my arm. The man wasn't blocking the path. He wasn't speaking. He was simply standing there looking at us again. There are certain situations where your brain starts trying to explain things quickly. Maybe there were 2 men who looked alike. The cap was the same. The shirt was the same. Everything looked the same. We crossed to the opposite side of the trail and walked past him as quickly as we could. Neither of us looked directly at him. I don't remember hearing the man move at all. When we got far enough away, M looked back. Then she immediately turned around again. He's still watching us. I didn't look. For some reason that scared me more than seeing him. We ended up jogging the rest of the way back toward the neighborhood. We spent almost 10 minutes trying to talk ourselves out of being creeped out. M kept saying he was mentally ill. I suggested he was waiting for someone. When I got home, I didn't even tell my parents about it. The rest of the afternoon was fine. My mom was making dinner. My dad was outside working on something in the garage. My younger brother was watching television at a volume that somehow managed to shake the entire house. I was sitting at the kitchen counter, eating chips and talking to my mom about a school shopping trip we had planned for the following weekend. Nothing seemed wrong. If the story had ended with the creek, I would have forgotten about the man years ago. Our house had a staircase that connected the first floor to a small upstairs hallway where the bedrooms were. From my bedroom door, if it was open, I could see part of the upstairs hallway and the top section of the staircase. That evening I was in my room getting ready for bed. My parents were still awake downstairs. I brushed my teeth, changed clothes, and got into bed. I wasn't asleep yet. I was reading or doing something, and I happened to glance toward my doorway. One of my parents was walking upstairs. I realized the figure wasn't moving. The person was standing near the top of the staircase. The hallway wasn't dark. A small lamp downstairs cast enough light upward that I could make out shapes. Someone was standing there. Not one of my parents, not my brother, someone else. The face, it looked covered. Even now I hesitate to describe it as a mask because I don't know if that's actually what it was. It could have been fabric, it could have been some kind of covering, but it looked like a pale face without visible features. The figure stared back. I screamed. The reaction was completely automatic. The second my brain accepted that there was an unknown person inside the house, the scream just happened. What happened next is one of the reasons the entire thing still freaks me out. The figure immediately turned and ran farther upstairs, not toward an exit, farther into the house. I heard fast footsteps moving away. I heard doors opening and people shouting. My dad came charging up the stairs. My mom was behind him. My brother appeared from somewhere looking terrified because he had no idea what was happening. My dad didn't waste time asking questions. He went through every room upstairs, then every closet, then the attic access, then downstairs again. Nobody found anyone. And that was where things became difficult to explain. Because I know what people are thinking. I imagined it. I saw a shadow. I was half asleep. None of those explanations account for the footsteps. They don't account for the fact that I saw a person physically turn and run. They don't account for my dad hearing movement upstairs before he reached the landing. Even years later, my father maintained that he heard someone moving when he came up the stairs. He fully expected to find somebody. Instead, there was nobody there at all. My parents checked every possible place a person could hide. The house wasn't large enough to lose someone inside it, especially with multiple people searching immediately after the scream. The man at the creek. The moment the idea entered my head, I couldn't shake it. The way he somehow appeared farther down the trail, the way the figure upstairs had stood completely motionless before running. I couldn't prove they were the same person. I still can't. But I remember becoming absolutely convinced of it that night. That certainty only got stronger over the next few days, although I never had any actual evidence to support it. My parents were understandably focused on figuring out whether someone had somehow entered the house. They checked doors, windows, and locks. As far as I know, nobody found anything useful. There were conversations with neighbors, some questions asked, and eventually things settled into that frustrating category of events where something clearly happened but nobody could explain exactly what. What made it harder was that my parents never completely agreed on what they thought had occurred. My dad believed I had seen someone. I know that because he said so more than once afterward. My mom wasn't dismissive, but she leaned toward the possibility that I had seen something in poor lighting and panicked. I don't blame her for that. If I had been the parent in that situation, I would have wanted a normal explanation too. The problem was that I knew what I saw. I wasn't waking up from a dream. I wasn't drifting off to sleep. I was fully awake, sitting up in bed reading. The figure had been standing there long enough for me to process that it wasn't a family member. Then it reacted when I screamed. That part always mattered to me. If it had been a shadow, why would it appear to turn and run? If it had been my imagination, why did the movement feel so immediate and natural? I wasn't scared of something supernatural. I was scared of someone. After that night, I found myself replaying old memories and wondering if every unexplained thing had really been as innocent as we originally assumed. I think the worst part was that I became obsessed with windows. I never realized how many windows were in our house until I started paying attention to them. During the day, it was fine. At night, every dark pane of glass suddenly felt like a place where someone could be standing unseen. There was one kitchen window that looked out toward a line of trees separating our property from another street. I used to get drinks late at night without thinking twice about it. After what happened, I would deliberately avoid looking outside when I walked past it. As I've gotten older, the less interested I am in figuring out whether anything paranormal happened that night, because I honestly don't think it did. If someone asked me today what I believe, I would say, I think there was probably a real person, a very real person. What I can't explain is how that person disappeared so quickly. I can't explain why they were inside the house in the first place. I can't explain why they never spoke. And I definitely can't explain why I was so convinced it was the same man from the creek. I sometimes wonder if there was somebody watching our family for far longer than any of us realized. The creak was simply the first time he accidentally let us notice him. The night in the hallway wasn't the first time he had been inside the house. It was just the first time I happened to see him. Whoever was standing there already knew the layout of our house well enough to move through it in the dark, and that seeing him that night wasn't the beginning of something strange. It was the first time we caught a glimpse of something that had already been happening for a long time. I remember why I got home later than usual that night, because my friend had spent almost an hour trying to convince me to take an old pool table off his hands. He was moving into a smaller place and didn't want to pay to store it, and for some reason, he thought I had both the room and the desire to own a pool table. We ended up standing in his garage arguing about it while drinking warm soda because he'd already packed most of his kitchen. By the time I finally left, it was later than I had planned, and I still had about a 40-minute drive home. Traffic was light because it was a weeknight, and I spent most of the drive listening to a local sports radio station. My girlfriend and I had plans the following day, and I remember thinking I should probably text her when I got home because she'd gone to bed early the night before and we'd barely talked. At that point in my life, we weren't married yet, but we'd been together long enough that we were already talking about apartments, future plans, and all the normal things people talk about when they're heading in that direction. When I pulled onto my street, the first thing I saw was that my porch light was off. That doesn't sound important, but I always left it on. I had one switch by the front door that controlled both the porch light and the hallway light inside. I rarely touched it because I preferred coming home to a lit entrance. Even before I parked, I remember noticing the darkness and wondering if a bulb had burned out. I saw the front door. I thought it was partly open. I realized it wasn't just cracked open. It was standing several inches ajar. I sat in my truck, staring at it. My first assumption wasn't that somebody had broken in. I thought I'd forgotten to lock it. It still felt more likely than somebody being inside my house. I got out and walked toward the porch. The door frame had a splintered section near the latch. It wasn't completely destroyed, but enough wood had been cracked away that it was obvious the door hadn't simply drifted open. Somebody had forced the door open, but why? My neighborhood wasn't known for burglaries. It wasn't some gated community, but it was generally quiet. I stood there debating whether to call the police immediately or go inside first. Looking back, I know people will say that entering was a bad idea, and they're probably right. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was mostly concerned about whether somebody had stolen my electronics or whether a pipe had burst and somehow damaged the door. My mind kept bouncing between explanations. I stepped inside and for some reason called out. I expected silence. Instead, I heard a noise somewhere deeper in the house. I grabbed a heavy decorative flashlight from a side table. It wasn't exactly a weapon, but it made me feel less vulnerable than standing there empty-handed. The guest room was empty. The bathroom was empty. My small office was empty. Then I got to my bedroom. The window on the far side of the room was open. I noticed that because I never opened that window. The screen had a tear in it from years earlier, and bugs always got inside. I realized someone was sitting on the windowsill. The image is still burned into my memory. A man was perched on the edge of the open window with his back mostly toward me. One leg was inside the room and the other appeared ready to push off outside. His posture looked almost casual, like he'd been sitting there for a while looking into the backyard. I had expected an empty room. Instead, there was a stranger sitting in my bedroom. I must have made some kind of noise because he turned his head. I wish I could describe him better. People ask that. The truth is that the entire encounter happened incredibly fast. He looked like a normal man, thin build, short hair. Nothing about him stood out in a way that would make him easy to identify later. If anything, that's part of what bothered me. He looked ordinary. If somebody catches you inside their house, most people panic. This guy didn't. He looked at me and spoke like we were continuing a conversation that had already started somewhere else. He said, "He'll be back." I remember staring at him because I thought I'd misheard. Then he continued talking. It wasn't aggressive, it sounded matter of fact. He said there was unfinished business. Then he mentioned my girlfriend by name. Her name. I felt every bit of fear. A stranger inside my house was talking about someone I love. I demanded to know who he was talking about. I asked him what he wanted. I asked him how he knew her. He didn't answer any of them. He mentioned something about her family. Not an extremely private secret, but something random enough that a stranger shouldn't have known it. I don't want to repeat exactly what it was because it involves her family, but it was the kind of thing that instantly confirmed he wasn't making blind guesses. The moment he said it, I knew he somehow knew who she was. Even now I can remember the cold feeling that spread through my chest when I realized that. The entire situation shifted from a burglary to something much stranger. I took a step toward him. That finally triggered movement. He immediately pushed himself backward through the open window. I rushed forward, but by the time I reached it, he had already dropped into the backyard. I leaned out and saw him landing awkwardly near the fence. He started running. My backyard wasn't huge, but there were enough trees and neighboring fences that visibility disappeared quickly once somebody moved beyond the property line. I climbed halfway through the window before common sense caught up with me. The man could have been armed. He could have had other people with him. I had absolutely no idea what I was dealing with. Instead of chasing him, I backed into the room and grabbed my phone. The first person I called wasn't the police. It was my girlfriend. I don't know why. Actually, I do know why. The second that man said her name, she became the thing I was worried about most. She answered sounding half asleep. I asked where she was. She laughed and asked why I sounded so weird. When I explained that somebody had broken into my house and somehow knew her name, she stopped laughing. I started asking her questions. Did she know anybody matching that description? Had anybody been bothering her? Had she noticed anyone following her? Had an ex-boyfriend been contacting her? Had anybody strange shown up near her apartment? The answer to everything was no. Eventually she said she was coming over. I told her not to. She ignored me. About 15 minutes later she was on her way, and I was standing outside my house waiting because I suddenly had no interest in being inside alone. Her car pulled up while I was pacing near the driveway. The second she got out, I could tell she was scared despite trying not to show it. She kept asking the same questions I'd already answered on the phone. What exactly did he say? How old was he? Are you sure he said my name? The problem was that every time I repeated it, it sounded just as bizarre as it had when it happened. We ended up sitting in her car instead of my house while we made the call. I gave a statement, explained what I'd seen, and eventually people came out to take a look around. I'm going to skip most of that because honestly there isn't much worth telling. Nobody found the man. Nobody found anything that immediately explained who he was. There were signs somebody had been inside the house. Beyond that, there weren't many answers. Neither of us could stop thinking about it. At first, we treated it like a random break-in. Weird, but maybe not connected to anything larger. Maybe he'd found mail. Maybe he'd seen photographs. Maybe he'd been watching the house and overheard conversations. The problem was that every explanation seemed to fall apart when we looked at it closely. The detail he mentioned about her family wasn't written anywhere in my house. It wasn't displayed in photographs. It wasn't sitting in some file cabinet he could have searched through in a few minutes. It was the kind of thing somebody would know only if they'd spent time learning about her specifically. I remember sitting at my kitchen table one evening with her and making a list of every person we could think of. Old coworkers, former classmates, neighbors, people she'd dated years earlier, people I'd argued with, even relatives. The list went nowhere. Nobody fit. The description I gave didn't trigger any recognition from anyone. About 2 weeks later, something happened. My girlfriend called me while she was driving home from work. She asked if I knew anybody who owned a dark-colored car. I said probably dozens of people. She told me she'd noticed the same car behind her several times that week. I asked if she'd gotten a plate number. She hadn't. The car never did anything obviously suspicious. It would just appear behind her and eventually turn somewhere else. If that had been the only thing, I probably would have dismissed it. The problem was that she was already looking for unusual things because of what happened in my house. Once somebody plants that seed in your head, you start noticing everything. I kept telling myself we were connecting unrelated events. At least I wanted to believe that. The problem was that every little thing became impossible to separate from the memory of that man sitting in my window. If somebody steals your television, you know what happened. If somebody attacks you, you know what happened. In our situation, we were left with 100 different questions and almost no answers. Why break into my house just to sit in a bedroom? Why wait there? Why say those specific things? Why mention my girlfriend? Why leave? Why not take anything valuable? Years have passed now. She's my wife. We've moved since then. The house where it happened belongs to somebody else. Most of the fear eventually faded. But the conversation always follows the same path. Maybe it was somebody who'd spent months quietly gathering information for reasons we'll never understand. He wasn't acting like somebody caught in the middle of a crime. When he spoke, it felt like he believed what he was saying. That calmness has stayed with me. My wife asks whether I think he was talking about himself when he said, "He'll be back." I don't know. I was around 15 when this happened. I'm 27 now, and even though a lot of things from that age have gotten blurry over time, that day is still weirdly clear in my memory. We lived outside a fairly small town at the time. As a kid, I spent a lot of time out there building forts, riding bikes, and doing all the stuff teenagers do when they're bored. My parents both worked regular jobs, and during the summer I was often home alone for a few hours before they got back. I remember getting home, planting myself in front of the TV. There wasn't anything special about the day. Nothing strange had happened beforehand. If anything, it was one of those boring afternoons where you keep flipping channels because nothing is on. At some point the house phone rang. That already sounds old-fashioned now, but back then we still used our landline constantly. Everybody knew the number. Friends called it, family called it, my parents' coworkers called it. I answered without thinking. The second I said hello, I knew something felt off. A man was on the other end, not somebody I recognized, just a deep voice. He asked, "What are you doing?" I was thinking it was somebody looking for my dad. I said, "Who's this?" There was no answer. I heard breathing, like somebody breathing through their nose while doing something else. The line wasn't silent. I could tell the person was still there. I asked again who it was. Nothing. The breathing continued. I got annoyed more than scared at first because prank calls weren't exactly unheard of. A couple kids at school thought they were hilarious. Usually they'd crack up and hang up after 10 seconds. This guy didn't. He just stayed on the line. I was feeling uncomfortable enough that I finally hung up. The whole call lasted less than a minute. Afterward, I stood there looking at the phone. Even at 15, I knew something about it felt wrong. Most prank callers can't resist talking. They want a reaction. This guy seemed interested in listening. I went back to the living room and tried to ignore it. About 10 minutes later, I started thinking about it again. I kept wondering whether I actually knew the voice and just couldn't place it. I convinced myself it was somebody messing around. I ended up going upstairs to my room. My room faced the woods behind the house. There was a desk under the window, a bed against one wall, and shelves full of random junk I'd accumulated over the years. I remember sitting at my computer for a while, talking to friends online, and trying not to think about the phone call. The weird thing was that I found myself checking the window every so often, just because I couldn't shake the feeling the call had given me. Looking back, I think my brain had already decided something wasn't right before I consciously admitted it. About 45 minutes passed. Then I heard what sounded like a dirt bike. People rode dirt bikes and ATVs through the woods. What caught my attention was where it seemed to be coming from. Really close. I walked over to the window expecting to see somebody crossing one of the trails behind our property, but I didn't see anything. The engine noise lasted like 15 or 20 seconds. Then it stopped. The sudden silence was what made me pay attention. I stood there looking through the trees for a while. There was enough foliage that you couldn't see very far, especially during the summer. After a minute, I shrugged and sat back down. I remember telling myself somebody probably killed the engine and was walking their bike somewhere. The kind of explanation people come up with because they don't want to feel nervous for no reason. Another 10 or 15 minutes went by. Then I heard this sound. It was so faint I wasn't sure I'd heard it correctly. A crunch, leaves, footsteps. The sound seemed to move around the side of the house. The footsteps continued for a few seconds. I should mention that our house made plenty of noises. Animals were everywhere. Deer crossed the property constantly. Raccoons got into trash, branches fell. This was like somebody walking. I moved closer to the window and tried to see through the trees again. Nothing. The phone call had creeped me out, and now I was turning every normal sound into something suspicious. Then I heard sounds directly beneath my window. My room was on the first floor at the back of the house. Somebody standing outside would have been only a few feet away from me. There was another sound, then another, enough to confirm somebody was there. I slowly stepped toward the window. I wasn't planning to open it. I just wanted to see who it was, maybe a neighbor. I reached the side of the window and looked out. A man was standing there. Years later, that's the image I remember. He was huge, an unusually big guy. Tall, broad shoulders, heavy build, the kind of person who instantly makes you aware of your own size. I wasn't a small kid, but standing next to him I would have looked tiny. He was staring at the window. I honestly don't know who was more surprised. He smiled, a weird smile. I remember a sudden rush of panic because I had no idea who he was. None. I had never seen him before. He raised one hand and knocked on the glass. Then he motioned for me to come closer. I stayed exactly where I was. The man said something I couldn't hear through the glass. I shook my head. He stepped closer. Then he spoke louder. "Open the window." "Who asks a kid to open a bedroom window?" I yelled back through the glass that my parents weren't home. The second I said it, I regretted it. I don't know why I said it. His expression changed when he heard that. He repeated himself. "Open the window." I told him no. The guy looked past me into the room, then back at me. Something felt wrong about the entire interaction. Most adults would immediately explain who they were. This guy never explained why he was there. He never gave a name. He never asked where my parents were. He just kept trying to get me to open the window. I backed away. The second I did that, he reached for the frame. He wasn't pretending. He actually tried the window. Thankfully, it was locked. I remember yelling at him, something along the lines of telling him to get away from the house. For the first time, the smile disappeared. He pulled on the window again. Then he stopped. He stood there looking at me. Then he glanced toward the woods behind him. Without saying another word, he turned around and started walking away. I stood there watching him move between the trees until I lost sight of him. The moment he disappeared, I grabbed the phone in my room and called my parents. My dad answered. I remember blurting out that there was a man outside my window and that he'd tried to get in. All he was getting was pieces of the story. Once he understood what I was saying, he asked if the man was still outside. I told him I couldn't see him anymore. Then he asked whether the doors were locked. At that point, I realized I hadn't checked. I ran through the house, making sure everything was secured while staying away from most of the windows. Looking back, I was more scared during those few minutes than when the man had actually been there. At least when I could see him, I knew where he was. Once he disappeared into the woods, I had no idea whether he had left or was still somewhere nearby. After I checked the doors, I went back to my room and called my mom. My dad had already contacted her, but she wanted to hear directly from me what had happened. I basically told the same story again. It was the phone call. At first, I treated those as separate events. They didn't. My mom immediately asked what time the phone rang and how long afterward the man showed up. I remember sitting there trying to estimate it. An hour, maybe a little longer, not very long. That was the first time it occurred to me that whoever called might have been the same person standing outside my window. My parents still had at least another hour before they could get home, so they called one of our neighbors. He lived a few houses away and had known my family for years. I won't use his real name, but let's call him Mark. Mark was one of those guys who always seemed to be outside doing something. If he wasn't fixing a tractor, he was mowing grass. If he wasn't mowing grass, he was cutting firewood. The man practically lived outdoors. He told my parents he'd head over immediately. I stayed in the living room because it was closer to the front door and I could see part of the driveway. When Mark pulled into the driveway, I ran outside to meet him. The first thing he asked was where I'd seen the guy. I showed him the back of the house. He walked around looking at the ground and scanning the tree line. At one point he disappeared into the woods for a few minutes. When he came back, he didn't seem particularly alarmed, but he definitely wasn't acting like I had imagined the whole thing either. He told me he hadn't found anyone. Then he asked me to describe the man. I did my best. The problem was that I hadn't actually seen a lot of details. When people remember frightening situations, they often think they'll remember everything perfectly. In reality, I mostly remembered how big he was and how uncomfortable he made me feel. I couldn't tell you exactly what color his eyes were. I couldn't tell you what brand of shirt he wore. I remember his build. I remember his face. I remember the expression. The rest is surprisingly fuzzy. Mark stayed with me until my parents got home. Every now and then somebody would walk to a window and look outside. My dad checked around the property himself. He didn't find anybody either. My parents ended up calling the police. An officer came out, took information, asked questions, and looked around. Nobody found the man. Nobody identified him. The older I got, the more I realized how strange that original encounter really was. If the man had knocked on the front door, that would have been one thing. If he'd been asking for help, that would have been another. But he came from the woods behind the house. He appeared outside a teenager's bedroom window. He repeatedly asked me to open it. He tried the window himself. Then he disappeared back into the woods. Even now I can't come up with an explanation that makes sense.